So we're representing a woman called Manokala and her 6-year-old son Ragavan. We've been representing them for a number of years. They were found to be eligible for a protection visa by virtue of being refugees. Subsequent to that, ASIO made an adverse assessment of them and found that they might engage in acts that are prejudicial to Australia's national security. So they were brought back into detention and they were not given a visa. So ASIO last week, in a rather dramatic turn of events, remade their assessment and found her to be no longer prejudicial to Australia's national security interests, and she was as such given a visa by the Minister and released into the community. In recent history, this is the first time that this has happened. It's a bit of a shock. Partly it's a shock because we have no idea why ASIO remade that assessment. As far as we can see, there's no new information that's been provided to them since the assessment was originally made over 18 months ago that would cause them to change their mind about this woman. I think what they were doing was remaking the assessment because they were concerned that it would be clear that this assessment was not based on valid reasons and that it needed to be reviewed. Margaret Stone was appointed to be the person who reviews these adverse assessments, and as a result of that process we were given access to the reasons for Manokala's adverse assessment. Now when I read them, I had very serious concerns about them. A lot of them are based on potential future acts or political sympathies, say, that she denies. So one of them is that it concerns political violence and whether she's got any sympathy for the use of political violence, and of course her answer to that was no, and she's never had any views like that. So we know the kinds of reasons that ASIO put forward, and to me they're very concerning because they're not based on clear evidence, and we certainly don't see any of the evidence that they're based on. But even if we did, I would still remain concerned about them because they ultimately involve potential future acts. But we do know that ASIO does feel under some pressure to revisit some of these assessments, and in this situation they've reviewed it in a positive way and released the refugee. What I think we can learn from that is that if Margaret Stone had not been appointed, I don't think this would have ever happened. So if we leave these people sitting in detention with no review process, then their continuing indefinite detention is almost certain. My view is that Margaret Stone's review process is flawed, partly because we don't get access to all the evidence. However, I think it's an important step forward from what it was before, which was absolutely nothing. So given that there is some review now over these assessments, I think it impels ASIO to reconsider some of these decisions more regularly. So it's undoubtedly a good thing and better than nothing. In my view, the Minister's responsibility should involve considering what to do in the context of an ASIO adverse assessment, rather than just responding reflexively by putting everybody in detention indefinitely with one of these assessments. There's a whole range of ways that you can deal with these assessments, including monitoring and regular reporting, all sorts of things. I mean, I imagine there's Australian citizens now that have adverse assessments over them by ASIO, and we don't lock them up. We treat them in all sorts of ways. I imagine we don't know, because ASIO is obviously very secretive about this, but there's no need to necessarily keep people in detention who have adverse assessments. So I think the Minister is ultimately responsible for these decisions, and the Minister needs to take more responsibility for it, and that includes looking at other options other than just responding in this way to ASIO assessments. Manokala is obviously thrilled to be released from detention, but she was released in circumstances that are not ideal. It's a real challenge. When these adverse assessments happen, it really causes that person to feel shame, and it brings into jeopardy their standing in the local community. She's someone who's fled political violence. Ragavan's second birthday, I think, was in a detention camp for refugees, and he just had his 6th birthday in Villawood 3 days before he was released. So that's 4 years of being on the run. The war in Sri Lanka claimed Ragavan's father's life, and it wasn't until they got here that they were really treated like criminals by being put in immigration detention. So they've had a terrible time of it, and then they've been released into a community with this shadow over them, and they're trying to build a life here after such a terrible life in Sri Lanka. I think that we owe them more than that, and I hope they'll be able to settle here and build a proper life for themselves. But the plight of refugees in this country, even when they're released from detention, is extremely difficult. She's essentially a single mother raising a child on Centrelink, and it's going to be a real struggle. So I hope that she's welcomed by the Australian community rather than marginalised, which is what you might expect when something like this has happened.